This is Tall Tale TV, your podcast for sci-fi and fantasy short stories. Of Bandits and Bad Magic by Lesley Herron. Chapter 8, Merita. Are you sure we're going the right way? Errik pulled his glasses off again, thumbing the lenses to clear them. He looked around and then back down at the tiny merc. We're so far from town. The cold rain continued to pelt them as they followed a set of swerving footprints in the soggy streets. Evan paused, standing to look around him. The houses had become more sparse, giving way to wide, empty patches of muddy road. It became apparent that not many villagers ventured this far, making the drunken tracks of the quarry nearly impossible to mistake. Trust me, this is our guy. He wasn't exactly subtle. Looking down, Evan could see the veering tracks stumbled across a barren and forgotten field up to a ramshackled house that leaned heavily to one side. It was more of a large shed than a house, and he would have guessed that it was abandoned from its outward appearance, save for the faint glimmer of light flickering through the sizable gaps around the ill-fitting door. Errik pushed his glasses up his nose, feeling a knot tighten somewhere inside. He looked around to see the kid was right. There was a single set of water-filled footprints pressed deep into the decaying soil of the abandoned farm field. The bare skeletons of long-dead plants poked out from the earth like the rough stubble of some giant beast. The house, if it could be called that, sat at the far end of the small field, nestled up against the very edge of the encroaching forest. The trees and plants were struggling to return the sad domicile to the earth, choking it with clinging vines and overgrown bushes. The porch roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect, and a sapling was pushing its way out from the floorboards in front of the door. Planks of wood had been hammered up over the windows, the shutters long since rotted away. Errik pointed at the house, quirking a brow. This guy is supposed to be a prince, right? That's what Atlas called him. Evan shrugged in return, moving closer to Barry's side to block some of the storm. Maybe he just went in there to hide? Errik felt a shiver run down his body as the chill in the air picked up. He squinted through the building fog of his glasses and sighed. Well, right now, getting out of the rain is topping my list. He rubbed at the back of his neck as he returned his gaze down to the tiny merc. I guess we should just go in there and, I don't know, hold him still until we can explain things to him? Don't you think charging in after a guy who's hiding in a place like that and tackling him to the ground might give him the wrong impression? Fair point. Errik dragged his hand down his neck before letting it fall to his side. But how do we keep him from running away again? Hey, he's your brother, not mine. He's not my brother. That's the problem. There was a long pause as the two stood in silence, contemplating their next move, until Barry jabbed him in the lower back with his nose. Errik stumbled from the jostle and looked back at the soggy bear behind him. What was that for? Barry began gesturing with his paws, grunting and grumbling as he did. Errik stared at the gesticulating bear, watching as his lips peeled back with every grunt and grumble. He waited for a moment before putting his hands up. I'm sorry. I can't understand what you're saying. Barry gave a huge, resounding sigh, dramatically dropping his shoulders as he moved around them, using his nose to point up at the house like a comically large bird dog. Errik felt a jolt of panic as he spotted a lithe figure pushing open the rickety door of the shack before stepping inside. Oh, crap! They darted across the muddy field toward the door. If the prince was terrified before, having an undead monster barge in after him would surely send him over the edge. Despite his tiny legs, Evan was the first to reach the house. He vaulted up the crumbling steps with the doctor hot on his heels. His hands were poised around the hilts of his knives, ready to strike, when he heard the squelching noises of Barry struggling across the waterlogged field. He turned to see him sinking with each step into the mud. Deciding not to leave his furry friend behind, he took off back into the rain. Errik nearly stumbled over the tiny merc as he moved to step inside. It took a second for his eyes to adjust to the dim light flickering from a lone candle near one of the boarded-up windows. The interior of the small, single-room home was in a further state of disrepair than the outside. Water was pouring in from various holes in the roof, filling pans and pots in some places, or being diverted by a mess of moldy blankets and rotten furniture in others. One section of the roof was in near total collapse and was being held aloft by several thick wooden logs. The sparse belongings of the house had been shuffled about, moved to the few dry places that escaped the leaks, including a small bed that looked like it had been dragged to the driest part of the room. Standing next to the bed, Errik could make out the thin, frail form of Bob. His arm was extended and reaching out towards the fear-stricken figure of Varen. The prince held a heavy burlap bag in one hand and looked as though he had been in the process of shoveling things inside before having frozen in terror at the sight of the creature. "Stop!" Errik reached out for Bob, grabbing hold of the tattered smock over his clothes to pull him back a bit. "You're going to freak him out!" At his words, however, the prince's eyes went wide and he dropped his bag before slowly sidestepping away. Evan appeared at the doctor's side, flinging away the mud on his hands. "I think it's a little late for that." He shifted to intercept the prince. "We should just go with Plan A. I'll tackle him and you tie him up." Varen jumped at the sound of the small dwarf and bolted, sprinting in a wide arc for the door. Unfortunately, and for the second time that night, the head of a large bear pushed into the room, blocking the only exit. Barry let out several angry grunts as he struggled to squeeze farther inside, but his frame was too wide and the structure creaked and shuddered, sending buckets of water down through the rickety roof. Errik turned, throwing his hands up. "Barry, stop! You're gonna bring the whole house down! Just wait outside." He watched as the bear left the doorway with a huff of indignation before turning back to the prince. The man was in the middle of an emotional breakdown, his eyes darting around the room from one intruder to the next. Evan was circling him like a hungry cat, and Bob's milky-white eyes were trained on him. Errik exhaled as he could swear he caught the shimmer of tears in those unfamiliar eyes. "It's okay. Just settle down." Varen turned and faced his brother, his beer-soaked mind racing as he tried to find an exit. There was a window somewhere behind him. He could easily smash through the boards and disappear into the forest before they even knew what happened. He took a deep, steadying breath and bolted for the exit. Errik winced as he watched the prince spin around and collide with one of the large logs propping up the collapsing roof. The beam shifted a foot, sending down a cascade of straw, stone, and old shingles through the widened gap. Varen collapsed back, unconscious, into the gathering puddle of rainwater. "Oof, that had to hurt. Well, we tried." Evan shrugged as he glanced about the room. "You know, this place really is a shithole. Come on, let's go." Errik frowned as he knelt down next to the prince and began checking his vital signs. "We can't just leave him like this." Taking a slow lap around the room, Evan pulled a face as he looked around for anything of value to pilfer. "I don't know why you care about that wet noodle. Like you said, he's not actually your brother. He's just some drunk who looks like him." Errik sighed. The tiny merc was right. But there was a pit deep inside of him. The way the prince looked at him with so much fear had forced him to think about how he tended to treat his own brother. While their situation had never come close to what clearly happened between these two, it made him realize he hadn't always been kind. "Look, I just feel sorry for him, okay? Besides, we're gonna need all the help we can get if we're gonna get off this realm. A crown prince might have the resources." "Seriously? The classiest thing in this joint is the termites. Evan's focus landed on the moldy fireplace, hidden beneath a choking layer of vines that had crept down through the rough stone chimney. He scratched at his head, wondering how long it would take to clear enough foliage to light a fire. But I guess this place is better than being outside. Barely. Speaking of which, we should probably move him before he drowns. Errik sighed, hiding a half-smile on his face. Yeah, you're right. He hooked his arms under the prince's shoulders and tried to lift him up, only to be reminded that he was the scholar of the group. His brother had always been the one to do the heavy lifting, another thing he had never had to think about because Vel always took the lead in those situations. Hey, Bob, you mind giving me a hand here? Plagued by forgotten memories and uncomfortable dreams, Errik awoke with a stiff spine and a throbbing headache. Sunlight was spilling in through the cracks between the boarded windows and the gaps in the roof. He squinted as he glanced around, his fingers fumbling for his misplaced glasses. He spotted the blurry outline of Evan, still sleeping, half on and half off the foot of the bed, having been nudged to the edge by the unconscious prince. Bob was standing somewhere to his right, blocking the bright glow pouring in through the open door. He swayed slightly with every ragged gasp of air and appeared to be dozing. Did zombies need to sleep? Errik shifted a little, his spine realigning as he stretched. His blurry vision landed on a chair in front of him that he was certain hadn't been there the night before. There was a person in the chair. He jammed his glasses on his face, blinking as the room came into sharp contrast. Atlas was staring down at him with tired eyes hidden behind a mop of disheveled hair, though the wayward strands did little to hide the smoldering scowl on his face. He clicked his tongue against his cheek as he pushed his back into the chair, folding his arms across his chest. Errik recoiled from the angry glare. Good morning? Atlas managed to keep his voice calm, but it carried a hint of malice. Oh, is it? See, I wouldn't know, because I just got done cleaning up your mess 15 minutes ago. He took a long, ragged breath through his nose and shook his head. Imagine my surprise when I find the lot of you. He looked around at the other figures, including his own friend, still asleep out on the porch. Napping. You told us not to leave, so we didn't leave. Errik pushed himself to his feet and shook some feeling back into his legs. He walked towards the hearth, which seemed to have gone out sometime early in the morning, as the embers, from what little wood they could scavenge, were still glowing. Atlas scoffed as he jumped to his feet. Aye, as in, don't run away. But I didn't mean shirk me with all the work. I could have used your help. I sincerely doubt that. Errik offered the other man a flat look as he reached for his overshirt, now dry from beside the fireplace. Besides, the prince knocked himself out, and we couldn't just leave him. What if he was seriously hurt? Or what if he woke up and skipped town on us? Atlas ran a hand through his bedraggled bangs and gave his scalp a hearty scratch. I don't know what you want with that waste of space anyways. Errik shook his head a little as he looked over his shoulder at the sleeping prince. I have questions I want to ask him. Maybe he can help us get out of here and find my real brother. Atlas let out a bark of derisive laughter, but held his words. Either way, he's still out cold, and as a doctor, I can't in good conscience leave him until he wakes up. Errik pushed his arms through the sleeves of his overshirt and flipped down the lapels. So, unless you have a spell for that... Atlas fumed. Oh, sure, now you be wanting my magic. Well, lucky for you, I do know a spell or two for waking up sleeping folk. The Arcanist held out his left hand and began wiggling his fingers. By the dark powers, I command thee! With his offhand, he snatched up one of the many pails of water and upturned the murky contents onto the face of the sleeping prince. Awaken! Varen snapped awake, coughing and sputtering as the sudden deluge of water threatened to drown him once again. He toppled out of the small bed, scrabbling to untangle himself from the sheets, but he only managed to faceplant the hard floor instead. The sudden throb of pain in his head exploded as the waves of nausea threatened to bring up what little food was in his stomach. He pushed himself to his knees, one hand cradling his swimming head as he continued to hack around a lungful of water. "Hey! What's the big idea?" The pile of blankets on the floor burst open as Evan tore his way free. "Whoever did that is getting a knuckle sandwich for breakfast. Mark my words." Varen looked down beside him to see an unfamiliar, extremely short dwarf struggling to extricate itself from his bedsheets. How drunk had he gotten last night? "You can blame Atlas." Evan offered the mage a hateful scowl as he tugged free his leg and stumbled towards the door. He stepped around the dozing undead and clambered over the sleeping bear before disappearing around the corner. Varen jumped at the sound of a new voice. He blinked several times and his vision cleared. His brother was standing by the fireplace, adjusting the collar of his cloak. He felt his blood run cold and his heart race as he scrambled away, his back hitting one of the support logs. He threw up his hands, shielding his face as he flinched. Errik felt a wave of confusion wash over him as he watched this man, who so closely resembled his own brother, begin to cower in fear at the mere sight of him. He made no attempt to move closer, but lifted his hands as he lowered himself to one knee.
Whoa. It's okay. We're not here to hurt you."
Varen lowered his trembling hands and looked up, his eyes glancing at the doorway across the room. Errik dropped his shoulders.
"Before you try to run, let me just explain. You're not my brother."
The prince shot him a look that was a cross between alarmed and hurt. Errik quickly corrected himself.
"I mean, I'm not your brother."
But he could see that sentence didn't clear up the situation as the prince simply stared at him, his expression dissolving into bewilderment.
"I'm going about this all wrong," he sighed. "I'm from a different reality, a parallel plane of existence that is divergent from your own in—" "Those are a lot of fancy words you be spouting there, your highness."
Atlas brushed some mist grime from his robes with a flat hand. Errik sighed.
"I'm not the king. I just look like him."
Atlas scoffed as he spun his chair around and sat down in it, resting his arms on the backrest.
"Oh, aye. He's been saying all that nonsense since he got here."
Ignoring the side remark from the mage, Errik could see that the prince had calmed down enough to be reasoned with.
"I know this might be difficult, with me looking like I do, but you're safe. My name is Errik, and I just want to ask you some questions. Is that all right?"
Varen pulled away from the support column, looking around the room for his discarded rucksack. The previous night was slowly coming back to him. He moved to collapse on the edge of the bed, looking over at the door. He could see the only exit from his home was still barred by an undead and that lumbering bear. His best chance of escape was to play along and hope it wasn't some sort of trick. He looked back at the others and nodded.
"Okay. Why were those guards treating you like that?"
Atlas stifled a yawn and waved a hand.
"Oh, well, that's obvious, isn't it? No one likes the prince. He got sent out to all these crap towns to take care of imaginary problems just so he's away from the big cities and out of the Regent Lord's hair."
Errik looked over his shoulder.
"That doesn't explain why they were beating him up. Look, if a drunken slob showed up in your village and took over your job, you'd want to tan his hide too."
Varen felt a rush of embarrassment and lowered his gaze. Errik felt something twist at his insides, and he softened his expression.
"If that's true, why don't you just leave? Go home."
Atlas leveled a finger at the prince.
"Because the Regent Lord doesn't want him back in the kingdom, so that people don't go getting any ideas about him retaking the throne."
Errik looked over his shoulder again and shot the mage an annoyed look.
Will you shut up and let him answer?
Atlas lifted an amused brow, a slow grin spreading across his face.
Be my guest. Ask away.
Turning back to the prince, Errik got to his feet and sat down on the edge of the bed next to him.
If it's really so bad here, why do you stay?
Herron looked from the man in the chair to the man sitting next to him and faltered.
Errik frowned. Look, it's okay. You can talk to me.
The prince gave him a pained look. Errik couldn't untangle the knots in his stomach.
What's wrong?
Atlas, having finally reached his tolerance threshold, threw his hands up in the air and stood, knocking the chair to the ground.
What's wrong is that he's mute, you numpty. He can't answer you. What? How? What happened?
Errik took a closer look at the prince, as though he might be able to see the problem. Atlas let out a long, exaggerated groan, tugging gently at the ends of his own hair.
Because you ripped his voice out the last time you were here. What? Why did I do that?
At the quickly downward spiraling situation, Errik cleared his throat and shook his head.
I mean, why did the king do that?
Popping his head through the doorframe, Evan pointed at something behind him. Guys? We got a problem. Errik got to his feet and rolled his eyes.
Of course. What kind of problem this time?
Evan swallowed hard as he looked over at the doctor. The pitchforks and torches kind. Errik poked his head outside the door and stifled a gasp. Just beyond the rain-soaked field, he could make out at least 40 people gathering into an angry mob. They were wielding all manner of farm equipment and brandishing blazing torches as they shouted. One man stood before the mob, thin and stoic, who appeared to be the calm among the storm. Atlas peered out beside the king.
Oh, wonderful. The local priest. My day just keeps getting better and better.
Of Bandits and Bad Magic is Book 3 of the ongoing series by Lesley Herron. Tune in every few weeks to hear the latest chapter as it's being written. If you'd like to listen to Books 1 and 2, you can find links in the description.
Hey, Bob, you mind giving me a hand in here? Oh, ew! What the? That is not what I meant.
Well, to be fair, you didn't specify.
That is so gross. Fine. Evan, will you help me get the prince onto the bed?
Seriously? Look at me, bro. How am I going to lift that? I may be badass, but I'm not superhuman.
Come on, man. Just put your back into it. Oh, that's not what I meant.